Cornhole is a very family-friendly yard game played in America. Some people call it the bag toss or the dummy boards, but you're seeing it increasingly at stuff like tailgate parties or backyard picnics. And I'm seeing it a lot of times at family-friendly events such as farmers markets. Because basically you can just set the equipment out and the rules are fairly simple and you can make up the rules and you just toss bean bags across a distance and try and get it in the hole. And close count. So it's very family-oriented. Parents can play it with their kids and everyone can have a laugh. Doesn't take too much time and you move on. Because of the simplicity of the game, the equipment is incredibly simple too. In fact, the sanctioning body for Cornhole, yes, there's a big organization for this sport or activity, so you can have national tournaments and national champions with it, has designed the equipment to be very DIY friendly. I mean, seriously, the platform itself should be 2 feet by 4 feet. Well, guess what size plywood you buy at the hobby section of the big box store? 2 feet by 4 feet. Sometimes a 1/2 inch thick, sometimes 3/4 inch thick, but the dimensions are very similar. Then they say you have to paint it with some latex paint so it'll be a little bit slippery so the bags will slide a little bit. No big deal, you're going to be painting it anyways. Other things, they specifically state the frame needs to be done at 90 degrees to the platform. Now why would they say that? To make it easier for the DIY guys. Basically they are specifically telling you, go buy some 2x4s, cut them at 90 degrees, make a rectangular frame the size of the plywood, and nail the whole thing together. Nail the 2x4s together, nail the plywood on top, and you'll have a fairly solid structure for you to play cornhole with. Then they say just put the top at 12 inches from the ground. It'll tilt up that way. Figure out the size of the legs, and just nail them in. There you go. You got your cornhole equipment. Couldn't have been simpler. Now this design is not going to last you forever. And that's kind of what I've seen at one of the local farmers markets I work. It's taken a lot of abuse over the years. Those kids jumping up and down on it. But they got a few good seasons out of it. And for the money you invest on it, a lot of people had a lot of fun with it. So I saw that situation and I said, hey, I'm the woodworker at the market. I can build you something better. So let me come back next weekend with something cool. So welcome to Worth the Effort Woodworking as we go about the process of building a little bit more sophisticated cornhole board. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut up some 2x4s into basically the frame. And remember, that's 2 feet by 4 feet. But I'm going to be cutting these at 2 feet and a 1/2 inch, 4 feet and a 1/2 inch. And you'll see why in a second. It's mainly for joinery aspects. Now, as usual, with my disdain for true measurement, I just measure 1 and that's going to become my template. I'm going to need 4 of these 2 1/2 inch sections to make 2 of these cornhole boards. So what do? I have one master and I use that as my template for all the others. That way at least they all come out the same. But one thing you need to consider when you're doing this technique is remember the pencil stayed on the outside of your whole line. So in this situation you want to take the line when you saw it. Now I'm using a miter saw simply because I have one. But there's no reason you couldn't do this with a hand saw or even a back saw using a miter box. It's all very simple. Just use what you have. I had this already set up, so that's what I'm using. Now one thing to consider is how you cut these pieces out of the boards. I am going to be using joinery on the ends instead of nails and screws, so I want to make sure I don't get any kind of knots anywhere close to the joinery because it'll just make it more difficult for me. And 2x4s are fairly cheap, so don't worry about wasting a little bit of wood. So we now have 4 long pieces and 4 short pieces to make the 2 frames. And I cut out 2 more identical short pieces because I'm going to put a brace through the middle. Because I know at this farmer's market the kids really pound on them, so I want to have a brace in the middle of the board. That isn't part of the original design from the sanctioning body, but I think it will be good for this application. Now that I've got all the boards cut to length, I'm going to go ahead and dimension them just so that they look nice. First, I'm going to flatten one side, and then I'm going to use that flat side as a reference using my jointer to create a perfect 90 degrees. And you could use a hand plane for this, or you could just not do it at all. It's not going to affect the performance, and it'll actually probably look just as good. I'm just kind of peculiar this way. I'm then going to cut it to my desired width using the table saw, and I'm going to thickness it with a new-to-me thickness planer. I believe it's from the late 70s or early 80s, but I've just picked up a used one, so we'll try that out. Now, I normally would not dimension pine, especially knotty pine, because it will destroy your blades. You are going to get nicks in your blades whenever you run a knot over it. It's just going to happen. But these are old blades, and the new-to-me jointer has its original blades, and I've already got a replacement set in stock. So I'm just going to go ahead and do it up and replace the blades after the fact. I had planned on doing that anyways. So let's get to jointing. So I've always said there's only two power tools that I just don't want to do without. One is a bandsaw, because I can just do about all cuts with a bandsaw that I need to. Resawing, lathe work, all that kind of stuff. And a thickness planer, just because it is such a massive labor saver. And guess what died 2 months ago? Despite numerous efforts to try and rebuild it, came to the point where the parts cost was just going to be too much. So instead of fixing that one anymore, I just found a little cheapo used one that I think is like 20 years old, and that'll hopefully get me through until I can afford a new one. So this is the very first time I've used it, so let's see if it works. Keep your fingers crossed. Price was right, but still, I want it to last me a little while. Snipe. I think I'm going to have to build some beds for it. I couldn't, the past owner couldn't find the extension beds. Oh well, it'll get me through. So we've got all the boards dimensioned, 2 feet and a half inch, 4 feet and a half inch. So now I'm going to do a finger joint on them. If you haven't seen me before do that, it'll make sense as I do it along. So I need to mark a baseline for what I'm going to be cutting out. So the baseline is going to be the thickness of this board plus a 1/4 inch. Remember, I added a 1/2 inch to each one, so a 1/4 inch on each side will give me that 1/2 inch, and it'll give me a 1/4 inch protrusion. I think it'll look kind of cool when I'm done. The concept for the finger joint is really quite simple. Just straight interlocking pegs that go together. Little fingers, so to speak. Basically, they're a dovetail minus all the angles. So a lot of the same techniques you use to cut dovetails we'll use here. I'm going to be using a bandsaw simply because that's just the way I've been doing it for a while. You've probably seen me do this joint in other videos too. But there's no reason I couldn't use a handsaw, a table saw, or a lot of people when they're making really fine finger joints would use something like a router and a little finger joint jig. This is just a simple way for me to do it, and the reason why I cut the baseline was so that I could have a stopping point for the bandsaw. This is just going to be a utilitarian device, so it should be okay. So, let's fire up the shop vac and get started. The key thing you need to remember when using the bandsaw is when you're cutting the corresponding piece, you need to adjust your fence the width of your saw curve so that it will fit in here just perfectly. So I cleared out most of the waste with the bandsaw, just going from diagonal to diagonal to diagonal, then along the baseline. And now I just need to get right up to the baseline, and I'm just going to do that the old-fashioned way with a chisel and mallet. I personally just go about halfway from both sides and call it a day. So I think these little jigsaw puzzle pieces kind of probably make sense to you by now. And what you want is a nice tight fit that will go together with just a little bit of hand pressure. That way the glue, if you're going to use glue, will work then. So now we have a nice tight corner joint. My next step is I'm going to route a groove along both sides for the plywood to sit into. That way we're not going to see the sides of the plywood. It'll be recessed in there and flush with this top. So we'll have a nice border all the way around for our little cornhole. But I want you to notice something. If I'm going to cut the groove in halfway on this board, because that one is freestanding, that'll be really easy to do, because I can either take a plow plane or just use a table saw. I'm going to be using a router today just because I want to try it out. That'll be easy to do, but this one I've got to do a stopped router and finish it up with a chisel because I don't want to blast through this side. I just want it to come down here so it'll be a nice square for that plywood to fit into. So before cutting the rabbets, I will loosely assemble these pieces just so that I know I'm getting the best looking pieces on the top and on the sides. That way all the big knots will be on the interior and nobody will really see it. And then I'll take my pencil and I'll mark out what part I need to be cutting off. So just so I don't make a mistake. And I'll set my depths for the side pieces too, because these are not going to be through cuts, giving myself a little bit to chisel off. I'm going to be using a 1/2 inch bit in my little portable router table, something I don't really use very often, just because it's a real pain to set up. But in this particular instance, I think it'll do a better job faster. Now it is a 1/2 inch bit, so I'm not going to be taking a full width pass on it because that's a bit too much and that'd be kind of scary. But I do want to set the depth on it and take that full depth pass. And how I do that one is take a measurement directly off the plywood, because we all know 3/4 inch plywood is not 3/4 of an inch. So I might as well just get it exact, and I just use a simple square to do that one. I don't worry about the measurements on the square, I just set the depth right off the piece, and I use that as a height adjuster for my router table. So, let's get some rabbets done. Well, an hour and a half later, I've got them all grooved out. Basically a 32nd of an inch at a time, because that's about all this thing could take, and it came in. Obviously, I'll hit the ends with a chisel. But you know, sometimes, an hour and a half later, my ears are ringing, my hands are numb. I'm just not sure this machine's worth it. I'm willing to bet that cop probably could have done this with a grooving plane and a saw or something like that a little bit quicker, and just would have been more enjoyable. Sometimes I just don't know about the router. So we now got our 4 side pieces, our 4 end pieces to make 2 boxes. Some of y'all might be thinking, why did we cut these 2 extra ones? Well, we're going to put brace through the middle, because I notice a lot of the kids, they bounce up and down on it whenever they're looking through a hole trying to find their beanbag. So I might as well add some support. So the first thing we need to do is I need to cut this down so that it will fit with the bottom of that groove, so that the plywood will sit on top of everything. So, how do you get that perfect fit? Let's use a hand tool trick with the power tool. I need to cut exactly this much off of both of these boards, so why measure when you can just bump it up and adjust that way? Slide it against the blade, bring your fence up to your work. Can't get more accurate than that. Now, woodworking is kind of a slow process. It gives you lots of time to think several steps ahead. And that is why when I cut out these center stretchers, I did them at the same time I cut out the end caps, because I wanted them the exact same size concerning these shoulders, because they will bump up into it and they will have the same protrusion coming through. So I might as well cut them at the same time. Now, the next step is to figuring out how to lay out the mortises for these tenons to go into. And obviously you want them to be exactly the same on both sides, so it'll be nice and square. So the easiest thing I know to do is to use the actual tenon itself to create the layout for the opening. So the first thing I want to do is create one face. I know that the hole is going to be 9 inches from the top down, so just to create it balanced, I want to put the tenon at 18 inches, so it will look somewhat okay. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure 18¼ inches down. Remember, we put in an extra ½ inch on these links so I could get 1/4 inch protrusion. Right there. And then I'm going to mark a line. And this is going to be the center of my tenon. So I'm just going to place the tenon down, kind of eyeball the center, and mark a second line. And this is my main line. I'm going to use this board. I'm going to transfer that line to all the other ones with my square so that they will all be the same. So this first one became the master. From here, it's just a matter of taking the side pieces, lining it up, and drawing the physical dimensions of the tenon. You can't get more accurate than that. Now I like to draw the square on the show side and shoot through this way. That way I know this will look good. If I get any blowout on the interior side, I'm not too concerned with that because not very many people will look at it. And to make sure I get nice crisp lines, I will go ahead and using a chisel define my layout. Now it's just a matter of boring and chiseling out the waste. There are times when it's just easier to pound straight in your workbench and get a nice clean cut. So for those times I keep a little scrap piece of wood that I just drop in here. And that way I don't worry about hitting my workbench because there's something in between the work and the workbench. After cutting out the mortises, I spent a little bit of time just putting a bevel on all my fingers because that seems to be the style when you're doing oversized fingers, to add a little bevel. Plus the fact, with all the abuse this thing's going to take in, having a bevel will make it last a little bit longer. It won't splinter out as much, especially in this pine. I really do like these rasps. Now, I'll admit, there's some types of joinery that I'm probably a bit of a snob about. Pocket holes being one of them. I generally do not use them in my furniture projects. But there are certain applications where this would be the proper traditional joint. And attaching this particular top to this base, this is the proper way to do it. I want it to be removable, but I don't want screws to show. So the best thing to do would be attach it from underneath with screws. Plus, because it's going to be outside furniture, I'm not sure my glue will hold in a heavy rainstorm, so I'm going to use pocket holes to reinforce these finger joints. Now, attaching these, because I've got grooves and a lot of other geometry involved here, I'm not going to use a traditional jig. In fact, this is one of those applications where probably if I had that cheapest little attach-on piece, it would be better. So I'm just going to pull this out, and I did a few test cuts to figure out my depths and stuff like that and how to line it up. I'm just going to use my workbench and hold fast to secure this. From here, it's just a matter of gluing and screwing the table assembly together. Now, I will not glue or screw this center section. It's going to be handling the weight going down. It'll be just fine, and it'll allow for a little bit of movement, but I will attach glue on the finger joints, and then afterwards I'll have it all clamped together before I drive in the screws. You want to clamp it together and make sure everything's straight first before you do those screws, because they're going at an angle. Pocket holes tend to want to move the individual boards. So make sure it's clamped up tight. And always remember your chopsticks, the proper tool for applying glue, especially if you want to throw them away afterwards. Next, just grab a couple chisels and hit those corners to square them up. So now we have an assembled frame ready for the plywood, but if you remember, we designed this thing to be towards the rules, which means 48 inches by 24, and I built the whole thing at 48 by 24. Actually, it's a 64 short this way, but shh, don't tell anybody. So I now need to cut the plywood, which came at 2 by 4, down so it will fit inside the grooves. And I did that, as I said earlier, because I just don't like the look of the side of plywood. I think it's ugly to look at the side. So why look at it if you don't have to? So I'm going to use a table saw and a circular saw with a homemade track to cut both the length and the width. Why am I using the circular saw to cut the width? Because it's unsafe to cut something on the table saw that is longer than it is wide if you're cutting the side portion, because there's a higher chance for kickback. So I'll just use my circular saw to cut this side right here. Poor man's festool. So the tops fit, but before I screw them down, I'm going to go ahead and pop them out. I'm going to take a sanding block and put a slight bevel on all the way around on both the plywood and the interior of the frame. For the simple reason, over time with water hitting it and stuff like that, there's a chance that these edges could splinter, and I don't want a kid running his hand over it and getting a little splinter and running off to mom crying. So if I round it over, it'll be a little bit more durable. I'll do the same to the outside, and then we'll screw it down and we'll put the hole in it. So now it's time to draw the circle, and if you remember, the circle is 9 inches down from the top and 12 inches from either side. So what I'm going to do is just take 9 inches down from each side, make the square, come in 12 inches from both sides just to make sure it is centered, and mark my center. Pretty good. Then I will just use a compass set to 3 inches to draw the 6-inch circle. Now, you wouldn't have to do this if you had a 6-inch circle cutting jig like you use to cut out the ceiling lights, but since I don't, I'm just going to draw the circle, use a jigsaw to cut it out, and then sand back to the line to get a nice smooth hole. Okay, now we need to put legs on the front of it so it will lift up the bed so that the top of it will be at 12 inches per the rules of the Cornhole Association. And those rules also state that the legs need to be at 90 degrees. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just create a quick tenon on one leg, make that tenon halfway so it will kind of nest up there and it'll rest on the side piece right here. And then I will use my bed of my bench to figure out the angle that will get this top edge at 12 inches. And then I'll just duplicate the same thing on the other 3 legs. So to find the perfect angle to cut this bottom leg down, I basically clamped it on the outside where it's resting on the shoulder. I've got my 12-inch square, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of that cut-off plywood, which is 3/4 of an inch. I'm going to lay it on the edge of my workbench. I'm going to lower the workbench until this ruler rests right in that corner. So that now makes this 3/4 of an inch or close enough to the bed, which makes that 3/4 inch cutoff. So now I just have to draw a line right on the leg. That not only gets me the perfect height, but the perfect angle for me to cut at. Now I just have to duplicate that on all the other legs. You're going to want to be sure to put a really good chamfer on these because the bottoms of these are going to take a lot of abuse, and a chamfer will just make it a lot more durable. Afterwards, a little glue and screw and they'll go on just fine. So installing these legs is just going to involve my chopstick, a little glue, and some 1 5/8 inch deck screws just to hold it in place until I get the rest of it going on. And you'll add a little bit of strength in case the glue for some reason fails due to rain. So there we go. 2 somewhat heavy-duty, robust cornhole platforms for the farmers markets for the kids to play on, abuse, and neglect however they want. I'll let them paint it up because they'll want to pick their own colors and stuff like that. But it was a fairly simple build. Took me a couple days because I was piddling around doing other stuff at the same time. I want to believe in each one of these, the plywood was about $10, and I probably had one 14-foot 2x4 built in for $5. So let's say $20 for each one. Not bad for something that'll last you 5 or 6 years. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting us by visiting our website, wortheffort.com. There's lots of different ways you can support us besides monetary contributions. And keep an eye out for our upcoming T-Shirt of the Month Club. And I want you to remember one last thing. It is always worth the effort to learn, create, and share with others. Let's take these out to the farmer's market and see how the kids like them.